This podcast series is presented by Archetype. Archetype is an early-stage venture capital fund focused on backing crypto entrepreneurs who are working to accelerate the decentralized future. We lead investments in seed-stage companies and are always open to speaking with crypto-native founders. For more information on our team and portfolio, go to archetype.fund. This season of Cross-Chain Examination is sponsored by Talos. Institutional investors across the digital asset industry have connected to Talos to access the entire crypto ecosystem via a single point of entry. Whether on the buy side or the sell side, from Wall Street's most storied firms to crypto-native come-ups, institutional investors are using Talos to accelerate their digital asset offerings. Talos provides technology infrastructure that powers the full trade lifecycle. Talos' integrated platform supports the entirety of the trading process, from price discovery to execution and settlement. Check them out at talos.com today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cross-Chain Examination. I'm your host, Catherine Wu. Each week on Cross-Chain Examination, we have on the smartest voices in the crypto industry to tell us what is top of mind for them. On today's episode, we have on Pooja Shah, the founder and CEO of Tephra Labs, where she's building infrastructure for large-scale human coordination, empowering the independent work economy along the way. Welcome to the show, Pooja.
Thanks, Catherine. Super excited to be here.
I'm very excited to have you on. So for our listeners who may not know, or they should know, you started your crypto career as one of the earliest folks working on Filecoin and then eventually becoming the head of product at Protocol Labs, which makes you an OG, by the way. And now at Tephra Labs, you're dedicating your time and career to bettering the future of work in Web3. So let's start with the big question. What to you is the future of work?
Yes, that is a great question and definitely a big question. And I'm really excited to, explore this a little bit more with you as well. I think that the future of work is obviously a huge space. And I think it's been very interesting to see in the last decade to maybe 20 years, just what the internet in particular has enabled around possibilities for how we think about what the future of work might look like, what options there are for people, how their careers may evolve, how organizations look different. So I think when we, sort of extrapolate to the future. So when I think about the future of work, there are maybe a few different scales on which I personally think about it. One scale is thinking about like organizations and these kind of meta coordination structures and how those will evolve going forward. And there's also at the maybe more micro scale, what an individual person's life might look like and how they might engage with their career and how that might look different going forward. I think because of the superpowers that the internet has afforded our society today, like just the ability to have these extremely global networks and just communication globally, and also just like much more like frequently higher bandwidth throughout the world on a like constant basis. I think that has, at the macro scale, kind of more thinking about what organizations look like in the future, enabled a lot more coordination between groups than has ever been really possible before. And so I'm really excited about like the emergence of different like alternatives to corporations and governments and sort of these, again, meta coordination structures that are much more nimble, smaller teams of people sort of working together to solve hard problems that can maybe over a sufficiently long period of time start to solve some of these like important problems at a much larger scale, which used to be the realm of more like these, gigantic organizations. And so really excited about that, like much more dynamic, nimble future and like these more smaller pods of people tackling hard problems on the meta coordination side. And on the individual side, again, I just think it's like so fascinating to see how just over the last several generations, even just like thinking about, our parents and our grandparents' generations and how people used to be career lifers at one particular company. You would join a corporation after graduating from university and be there basically for your entire career. And over the last several decades, I think we've seen that, obviously there's been a lot more adaptability and flexibility with how people think about the companies that they work at throughout their career, to the point where today it's not just working at different companies throughout their career, but also people having completely different career changes as well throughout their lives. And I think that sort of thinking about, again, bringing that like freedom and choice and autonomy into individual people's lives too is something that is pretty exciting. So sorry, long answer, but I think there's a lot to explore on both of these scales. So
no, I love the long answers. Keep them coming. I think one of the things I heard and, got me thinking is our generation or the new generation's relationship to work is also really different in the way they think about their careers. And so like one of the things that I've been saying a lot recently to like younger folks thinking about their career is don't find the job that you have to suit, find the job that suits you. And I think that's like a really fundamental, like different examination of relationship that you see with like your career and your job and your workplace.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. So is there a difference, given that you are in the Web3 crypto space as you're, thinking on this problem and thinking about the future of work, is there a difference between the Web2's like version of future of work and like a Web3 native, a crypto native future of work, or do they converge to be the same thing?
Yeah. I definitely do think that there is a difference. And I guess I'll just sort of preface my response here by saying that for me, Web3, I think is really a set of ideologies and principles about how do we build solutions to problems, more like kind of a means to an end, as opposed to something that's very dogmatic or very prescriptive about, we need to build smart contracts that do X, Y, Z. Like, I think it's a much more open industry than sometimes people kind of describe it as. And I think for me, Web3 is really about sort of principles of ownership and just in general, like, humans owning their life experiences and their data. It's a lot more about privacy. When we talk about building actual technical systems, it's a lot more about modularity and composability, prioritizing open source software as much as possible, just building like open communities that also feel a lot of ownership over the products and protocols and systems they interact with. And so I think when thinking about kind of that set of models and like philosophies, when we think about designing systems compared to what has historically been the way that technology has been built, which is a lot more of a focus on, proprietary solutions and companies owning data as opposed to really empowering their users. I think that sort of difference in approach does translate to the way that different companies think or different groups think about the future of work and the solutions they're building. So I would say, there are increasingly in the last several years, there have been numerous talent marketplaces that have developed in the Web2 world. And I think one of the things that is really interesting, I think a lot of these have been really successful in providing access and opportunities to people that are extremely talented, especially people who live in other non-Western parts of the world, for example, right? And just giving them access to these really incredible opportunities. And they've been successful from that perspective. But one of the things that I think personally is just not the way we should build these types of solutions is it ends up feeling very proprietary. Like, if you are someone who works on like is finding opportunities through a particular Web2 marketplace, you are part of the pool of talent that it almost feels like you are labeled as like belonging to, this community or to this company, which doesn't make any sense. Right. And if you like worked on a project that you found through this like avenue and, the work that you did, any sort of reviews and reputation or anything like that you gain as a result of doing this work, the relationship that you build with a client or your teammates, that's something that you can't really take with you off the platform and take into other contexts, which doesn't really make sense because we as individuals really should have that ownership over our career and how we want to grow. And that's something that belongs to us as people and not like some, product development company somewhere. So I think that there are some differences for sure. And I would say, on the Web3 side, I've seen a lot more of prioritizing the individual first and wanting it, really having it be about like providing individuals with like the choice and autonomy and a lot more like openness and kind of recognizing that it's like, yeah, you're a member of a community, but you don't belong to that community or you're not going to be like monetized by those product developers in the same way that you might in like a Web2 context. So I do think there's a difference, but obviously still like good intentions on both sides.
Yeah. I mean, there are, I think, signs with the way that certain pockets of crypto works. Like, maybe this is the future of work. This is what the norm is going to be. Like, so one example, I think like in general, this is like even before COVID, if you can still remember, a lot of crypto companies were comfortable hiring remote. And I felt like that was like much more prominent in crypto than it was in like, your traditional Web2 company. And so that's number one. Number two is like with the proliferation and popularity of DAOs in the last like 2 years, these forums have gone really, really active. People are actively discussing, whether it's governance matters or, Uniswap is discussing fee switches in public, like members of their teams talking about it. On the ENS forum, like folks have, publicly open weekly calls with the different working groups that like anyone not just in their community, not just token holders, but anyone period can join and like listen in. The Ethereum core dev calls have always been open to the public. You can always tune in, like literally a Google Meet link to like dial in and hear what they're talking about. And so like there are aspects, and I think those are like working streams that, you know, can be public and I think make a lot of sense to be public. And the authors or the folks who work on them also have a lot of ownership because they're the ones talking about it, presenting to the public. I don't see this way of work in like the Web2 world. And I think it's pretty like future forward thinking.
I totally agree. Yeah. And I think part of it is also, I think what you mentioned about the ownership piece and how, you know, these open source contributors and project sort of leaders are definitely recognized for the contributions they make because they are sort of like visible members of a community. And that's like very respected, which I think is really interesting as an alternative when thinking about ways in which people can feel really rewarded for the work that they're doing. And it's obviously, you know, financial compensation is really important, but it's also how respected are you in a community, or like, what is your reputation like in a community, and what are ways to kind of build that over time, which I think matters a lot. And to the extent that organizations can provide that sort of visibility and recognition to people and that ownership, that can go a really long way. I know like some folks had some like really close friends who worked at places like Google X, which are, you know, sort of like the innovation. I mean, Google's doing a lot of innovative stuff throughout, but obviously kind of the moonshot factory. And it's like really fascinating to just hear about X's approach to research and how like there's a lot of like really incredible research that's happening within these types of organizations. But even being able to publish about the work that you've done as a researcher because you work for this organization whose business model is predicated on keeping everything a secret. It's like really difficult to get your work out there in the open. And that's actually like a disincentive to some of like the most talented people who want that recognition and like want people to build on their work too. So definitely agree.
It's actually crazy. It's like not that much to ask for. It's like, give me credit where credit is due.
Yeah, exactly.
So having just covered the future of work, but related to work, I think hand in hand is organizations and companies. And maybe that's an already outdated view of work and organizations, but perhaps with good reason, because I think that's been the status quo for so long. So as the future of work evolves, do organizations and companies also change with that?
The types of questions that I spend a lot of time thinking about are, what does this look like in some sort of like future steady state? You know, one of the questions I am really motivated to try to answer is, if we want to solve problems like climate change, which may require the coordination of hundreds of millions of people or billions of people, what are those organizational structures going to look like? I think it's extremely unlikely that when we talk about that type of scale, it's not going to be one company or like citizens of one government, one sort of like nation state that are working together in order to solve these types of hard problems. And my hypothesis is that it looks a lot more like individual people, small squads of people that are flexibly sort of coming together as needed to solve problems, and then sort of like going their own way and maybe picking up something else, working on something else when the projects that they have come together to work on have completed. I definitely think in the future, there will still be some notion of, you know, nation states or more like traditional governance. And also, I don't know how far into the future we're talking, but at least for like maybe, let's say like 50 years, also like corporations for sure, you know, all of these like structures do exist for a reason, like you mentioned, even though maybe that's like some sort of, you know, couple decades out type of steady state. I think in the meantime, it'll be really interesting to think about the transition between the structures that exist today and how we get to that sort of world. And I think that already, like to your point of what you were mentioning with the pandemic and also just the powered by the internet and some of the technology that people have been building the last several years, how easy it is to engage like workers like all over the world, like being able to perform remote work. Sort of like, I think that there are already so many examples where companies in particular are like engaging workers in different ways than they have historically. Like there's been much more openness to, you know, outsourcing and engaging people as independent contractors and things like that, which don't feel really that, you know, sexy, I guess, but it's kind of like interesting because it feels like that's the precursor to this sort of like flexibility and openness and like permeable, like sort of flexible boundaries in organizations that may lead over time to less of this like consolidation aggregation effect to kind of bring everyone and everything in-house, and more just like enabling groups to stay like independent and separate over time, but still like able to collaborate.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I think this benefits really is the individual. And I think one of the I guess, like criticisms, or one of the things that people jump to really quickly is then, okay, well, then there's no, effective decision making any longer, and there's no effective like leadership anymore in the future if, everyone's their own boss, or whatever. I mean, this is like a take. It's not my take, it's a take. And so, future of work, we talked about future in organizations, but what about within those organizations, or within the future of organization leadership? How does that look like? How does that change? How do decision making within an organization change or look?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that this is one of the really hard problems to solve, I guess I would say, or like, I do think that leadership is extremely important. And I think in particular, leadership can look a lot of different ways. It may not need to be, one individual. It could be like a group of individuals, but continuity is really important. Like, I think there is definitely it is important to have context persist, within an organization. And if every day the set of people working on a project is constantly churning and swapping out, it's going to be probably really difficult for that project to sort of get off the ground. So I do think that leadership is extremely important. I don't think that that's going to like totally go away. I think that what's really interesting though is thinking about what is the role of leadership and what are the ways in which we can kind of decouple some of those functions into different solutions that enable some of this like greater flexibility and autonomy for individual people, and that gives them like a lot more ownership over their careers. I think there are some elements of leadership which is kind of like defining the work that needs to be done, which I do think is something that can be decoupled, honestly. So, from this idea of someone who's actually like managing an organization or like helping the execution of an actual project through to completion. The reason I believe that this is like something that can be decoupled is I feel like this actually the Web3 space is like a very interesting microcosm of this, where, you do see people like Vitalik in the Ethereum ecosystem, for example, who is not directly managing any human to like do anything, or maybe that's not true. I mean, maybe there's some specific projects, but largely speaking, is not the like CEO or executive director of like an organization. But with the sort of like cultural like cachet that he kind of has and the ability to express thoughts like very articulately, is able to kind of move an entire ecosystem in a particular direction, like the paper on decentralized society and like soulbound tokens, articles like that. When Vitalik will post about some of those things, like hundreds of people, if not thousands, get really excited about that, like, start building businesses, raise venture funding in order to support those ideas. And so it's really interesting to kind of see how that sort of like visionary element can come from a lot of different places. And I think that that's increasingly something also that I think is really cool about Web3 solutions to this problem versus maybe Web2 a little bit, where I think of it now as like ideas, talent, and capital. When we think about like talent marketplaces or connecting people to opportunities, it's not just like talent to opportunity, which generally tends to equal idea plus like capital. The ideas can come from different places too. And it's kind of about like figuring out how to do efficient allocation between and matchmaking between all three of those. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I really like the equation, like mixing the elements, ideas, talent, capital. I think that's great. Makes a lot of sense. So you were at DevCon in Bogota in October, and I was as well. And, when you walk into the hall, there were, all these kind of like little banners. And there was one that kept on going across like the escalators called the Coordination Game. It's the name of I think a movie on Ethereum or crypto that is getting made. But the reason I bring that up is because someone had pointed to me and they were like, I hear the word coordination a lot in crypto. Like, why is that? Like, what is the coordination that's being done? And I think I gave like a very like unclear, vague answer because like my brain wasn't working. But I was hoping you could give like a better explanation, because I do think a lot of what you're talking about ties into the coordination game, or like, why people talk about coordination. Like, what are you coordinating within crypto?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's one of the fundamental ideas in the crypto and Web3 space broadly, is this idea of coordination. Obviously, again, broad and vague and can mean a lot of things. But for me, I think one of the really amazing primitives that was sort of like discovered in the early days of this industry was the ability to use incentives programmatically to, result in emergent behaviors that were like orchestrated by software that previously would have been basically impossible. Like there weren't really great examples that had been able to kind of result in the same effect. And being able to do that at a scale, thinking about, geographic diversity, like the number of resources that were put to use, the like financial capital that was sort of engaged, in that type of orchestration, just like the sheer number of computing resources, right? Like that was really unparalleled. And I think for me, so it's really about, like that application of programmatic incentives to result in behaviors or to like engineer behaviors that we think are really healthy in different systems. So you mentioned I used to work at Protocol Labs and was one of the leads for the Filecoin project. And one of the things that's really amazing, right, is just like with this relatively small group of people being able to design a protocol that was, this like network that we launched in October 2020. And that network has been able over the last like couple of years to be able to bring online dozens of like exabytes of storage capacity, which represents like, I don't actually know the exact number now, but I think it's, definitely like in the billions of dollars of like hardware investment to support this network, right? And it's just like in a couple of years being able to bring online and represents like thousands of people throughout the world who are invested in these ecosystems and all there for the purpose of like storing data in a decentralized way, because we feel like that's a stronger foundation for the future of the internet. And so I think that is like, for me, like that's really the type of coordination that I think very fundamentally crypto enables. I think when we start to think about those sorts of use cases where it's more about, like easily measurable resources like compute and like storage capacity and things like that, it's a little bit easier. It's still extremely difficult to do that in kind of like a purely software enabled way and like trustlessly and publicly verifiable and things like that. But it is still easier to imagine bridging the gap with like getting computers to do stuff than it is to get humans to do stuff. And so I think that's now in the crypto space, which has been really interesting, especially with the emergence of DAOs and a lot of the conversation around public goods funding and, some of these like newer, like refi and some of these ideas that people have gotten really excited about in the last year or last couple of years. I think we're starting to see a little bit more of people trying to apply some of these like programmatic incentive principles to coordinating human behavior in a really novel way. And I think it's extremely hard and much harder than getting computers to do stuff. So we still have a long way to go, but I think that's like a really exciting, territory to think about. And that's where sometimes people in the space are a little bit anarchist and they're like, oh, down with the nation states. It's like, yeah, maybe, who knows what creative stuff people will be able to come up with. So
yes. I wish you were next to me when I was explaining this because I was like, but I think why, it's coordination because you're basically, you want to convince people to adopt a brand new, whatever behavior, let's say.
Yeah.
And you have to do it in the way that everyone needs to agree on, but you can't do it in the way that like makes people feel like they don't have a choice and are forced upon, right? And so maybe that looks like a mixture of incentivization, maybe it appeals to ideals, but whatever it is, you need to essentially coordinate a large scale of people to adopt essentially a new behavior. And I think so much of, when you look at protocol design, when you look at token or whatever, token economics, that's essentially what it is, right? It's like, how do you convince a large user group or user base to adopt like a brand new behavior / way of thinking / way of using a product?
Yeah, absolutely.
There's not like an easy one word answer for it.
No, there's not. Which is why this space is so fascinating because, it's just like a combination of like so many things. It's like cutting edge computer science and also game theory and economics and also math social psychology and also brilliant exercise in marketing. And it's just crazy. It's our end product. It's crazy. It's like all of it. It's fun though.
Well, this is a good segue because you're currently building something that's hopefully, going to achieve some new behavior. So let's talk about what you're building. So as I mentioned earlier, you're the founder and CEO of Tephra Labs, but Tephra Labs also sits on some products, and Radius is the first product out of Tephra Labs. So I'm going to give a one-liner, and obviously you should correct me if I'm wrong on this, but Radius is essentially a decentralized network that connects independent workers and teams of the best projects in Web3. Take that from your website. How does Radius actually work, and how does it relate to the overall mission of Tephra Labs?
Yeah. So as you mentioned sort of at the beginning, at Tephra Labs, we are really excited about these kind of large scale coordination problems because we think it's just necessary. Like, there's something that's not working in the world today. And we think it's really important to fix it because there are big global problems and opportunities that we face as society. And so we want to experiment with like different ideas for how we can do coordination better and hopefully make a big impact against those needs that we face. So as you mentioned, Radius is like this network. And initially, I would describe Radius as basically a talent marketplace in a way. Occasionally, I call it a project marketplace. But really, it is this solution in which we basically try to do a little bit of this like matching between ideas, talent, and capital, as I had mentioned before. And I think when we think about like these large human coordination problems, if you think about a lot of these different examples, it feels like you can abstract away a lot of the differences between the different ways in which we need to coordinate people. And at the end of the day, it comes down to those sort of elements. It's like, what are the important things that need to get done in the world? Who are the people that are looking for those types of opportunities and that would be a good fit for those types of opportunities? And how does that work become like sustainable? And so I think that with Radius, that is kind of our intention. We're starting by building a product that like people can interact with. We take what we're sort of calling like a product-led protocol development approach. So starting by building like a really easy to use interface for people to find these types of opportunities, build connections with other builders that they can kind of like pick up these projects with, start to build a reputation within certain ecosystems and kind of like carry that reputation with them as they work on like different projects and in other ecosystems in Web3. And then ultimately, all of this hopefully will be the foundation for a broader, more generally applicable protocol that we hope will like support this kind of initial set of use cases in Web3, but can also be applied in other contexts. And that's when we talk about wanting to address things like climate change. It's kind of like, we hope that we can build this more general substrate that can then support communities that are interested in these like more focused areas, but still have kind of the same needs to like allocate talent, capital, and ideas.
Yeah. I saw, you told me, but I also saw that you recently launched a fellowship. I think this was 2 months ago or in October sometime. Why launch a fellowship and really like, what is it?
Yeah. So the Radius Fellowship is a protocol specific engineering fellowship. And basically the idea is it's kind of like a short 4 to 6 week boot camp where we'll kind of take a cohort of people that are synchronously participating in this fellowship program, basically help them form connections with each other, work on like realistic projects basically that are adding a lot of value and that are high impact within a particular Web3 ecosystem. We're trying to align, grants as well, like grant opportunities for those builders too, so that they kind of have that sort of funding to continue working on those projects if they are deemed to be high impact. And basically like get their start within a particular ecosystem in Web3. So this is the first time we're doing it. And, we're like an early stage company. And so we're like trying a lot of things at the moment to see how are we going to be able to like get to the goals that we have laid out for ourselves. But the reason we decided to start the fellowship was because one of the things that we noticed with right now with Radius, we're interested in supporting Web3 ecosystems in achieving like really important parts of their product and protocol roadmaps that maybe some like internal full-time employee team is not working on for whatever reason. Maybe it's like just not a good fit or they're like, they don't have the bandwidth to take it on. So it's like this really high impact work within Web3 ecosystems. And one of the things that we noticed was that a lot of the projects that were deemed to be like really high impact required, in many cases, kind of a level of knowledge and like familiarity with an ecosystem and with sort of the principles and ethos of that ecosystem, but also the tech stack that if folks like were not already part of that community, it would have been difficult for them to sort of get accepted to work on those types of projects. And so that was something that we thought was a gap that someone needed to fill. And that was kind of this idea of like, let's see if we can kind of get builders who are like experienced and talented and really energetic about sort of getting their starts in Web3, but maybe don't have that protocol specific and ecosystem specific know-how, cover that gap and then basically set them up so that they have just more access to opportunities, whether it's like independent projects or full-time opportunities or whatever it is. So so we're kind of like launched that and officially are kicking off early next year with our first cohort. It's going to be about like 50 builders. So really excited to give that a go.
Amazing. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I think there's obviously people with a lot of really good skill sets that maybe just need like a onboarding to Web3 or onboarding to a specific ecosystem within Web3, because we all know that they're all very different. So I think it's a great initiative. Last question. It's not really a question, but it's more of a chance for you to plug. Where can people go follow the work that you're doing? And if you're going to launch like a fellowship again, where can they find it? And if you're hiring, where can people find that?
Amazing. Yes. Thanks for the setup. So our website is tephra.com, which is TEPHRA.com. We are definitely hiring. So, if anyone's excited by these problems, we would love to meet you. So you can find the links to our jobs board there, also a link to Radius. And we also, well, the fellowship website, I guess, is fellowship.radius.space if you're interested in that. Definitely check that out. Yeah. And we're also on Twitter. So join Radius on Twitter is probably the most relevant place to find all the good content.
Amazing. Well, I can't wait to see what you have planned in store for the next year. But thank you so much for taking the time to, coming on my podcast, talking about Tephra, talking about the future of work, organizations, leaders, leadership, and coordination.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is always so fun to chat with you.
Thank you all for tuning in to another episode from Season 2 of Cross-Chain Examination, hosted by Catherine Wu and presented by Archetype. If you like this episode, please give it a 5-star rating, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to the show if you haven't already. Also, make sure to check out Season 1. We have 10 episodes from awesome guests talking about all kinds of topics, from privacy and crypto to crypto regulation to many, many other topics that I care deeply about. Share this also with a friend, with a coworker, and maybe even family if you enjoyed it. And give us a follow on Twitter. We are at CrossChainPod. DM me, at me with any suggestions, guests you would like to hear, and anything else. Thank you so much again, and hope you tune in to our next one.